There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house once its last owner has died, and I have come to believe it is not the silence of absence but of accounting, as though the walls themselves are waiting to see whether the next name carved above the door will have earned its place there. I inherited Ashvale Manor on a gray Tuesday in October, 3 days after my father's funeral, and I did not understand until many weeks later that I had inherited, alongside the house and the land and the modest fortune attached to both, a debt I had never been told we owed. My name is Cordelia Ashvale, and this is the account of the summer I learned that everything I owned had another name written beneath my own, in ink so old it had nearly faded past reading. My father died the way careful men often do, suddenly, and in the middle of a sentence he never finished. He had been dictating a letter to his solicitor regarding the estate's autumn accounts when his heart simply stopped, and I have spent more hours than I would like to admit wondering what word he intended to say next, as though finishing that sentence for him might undo the silence that followed it. I think of him most often not at the funeral, which I remember only in fragments, but on an ordinary afternoon some months before his death, when he found me in the east hallway studying my grandmother's portrait with the particular boredom of a child assigned to memorize her own family. He came to stand beside me without a word, the way he often did when he wished to say something and had not yet decided how. "She was a harder woman than that portrait lets on," he said finally. "Kinder than people remembered her, and harder too. I never knew quite what to make of the two things living together in one person." He did not explain further, and I did not think, at 11 years old, to ask him to. I have wondered since whether he was already circling, even then, some knowledge he had not yet found the courage to hand to me directly, passing it instead in small, oblique warnings I was too young to properly receive. He left me everything. This was not unusual. I was his only surviving child, my mother having died when I was 11, and the entail on Ashvale had been broken 2 generations before, by a grandfather more interested in keeping the land in whatever hands loved it best than in whatever hands happened to share his surname. I had grown up understanding, without ever being told outright, that the house would one day be mine, and I had grown up loving it the particular fierce way one loves a thing they have never had to imagine losing. I did not imagine, standing in the solicitor's office 3 days after the funeral, that I would spend the rest of that year learning I had never fully understood what I was inheriting at all. The solicitor, a patient, gray-templed man named Mr. Aldous Fenwick, who had served my father for over 20 years, handled the transfer of the estate with the brisk competence of a man who had done this many times before and found no particular comfort in slowing down for grief. There was only one moment in our first meeting when his composure faltered, a brief hesitation, quickly smoothed over, when I asked whether there was anything in my father's private papers that required my immediate attention. "Nothing that cannot wait," he said, in a tone I did not, at the time, think to question. "Your father was a meticulous man. You will find everything in good order." I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. It would be nearly a month before I understood that "in good order" and "entirely accounted for" were not, in my father's case, the same thing at all. The weeks immediately following the funeral passed in a haze of condolence visits and correspondence I could barely make myself read, each letter offering the same 3 or 4 sentiments rearranged into slightly different order, as though grief itself came pre-printed and one needed only select the appropriate card. I found myself, more than once, standing in rooms I had known my entire life and feeling them shift subtly out of focus, the way a word repeated too many times stops sounding like language at all. Ashvale Manor did not feel like mine in those weeks. It felt like a very large, very quiet waiting room, and I its only remaining occupant. My cousin Silas arrived for the funeral and stayed considerably longer than the occasion required, a fact I attributed at the time to grief and family duty rather than to the more complicated motives I would later come to understand. Silas Ashvale was my father's brother's son, some 8 years my senior, and he had spent the better part of the last decade managing a smaller family property some 40 miles north, competently by all accounts, though with the particular restlessness of a man who had always known, in the private arithmetic he kept behind his composed face, exactly how many relatives stood between himself and a larger inheritance he would never openly admit to wanting. "You'll need help settling the accounts," he told me, in the library, a week after the funeral, with the easy confidence of a man offering charity rather than requesting access. "Your father trusted my judgment on estate matters more than once. I'm at your disposal for as long as you need me." I was grateful, at the time, in the uncomplicated way of a woman drowning in grief and unfamiliar ledgers, grateful for anyone willing to wade into the paperwork alongside her. I did not yet know enough to wonder why a man managing his own modest property 40 miles north had so much free time to spend in mine. He was, in those early weeks, unfailingly generous with his time, in a manner I have since learned to recognize as its own particular kind of currency. He reviewed tenant contracts I would otherwise have puzzled over for days, explained the estate's seasonal accounts with a patience that felt, at the time, like genuine kindness rather than careful positioning, and never once made me feel foolish for the gaps in my understanding, gaps my father, in his methodical way, had simply never gotten around to filling before his death caught us both unprepared. It was only much later, turning the memory over with the benefit of everything I would eventually learn, that I recognized how carefully Silas had steered every conversation away from the estate's older records and toward only its most recent, most uncomplicated business. "Your father kept everything in his head more than on paper, I'm afraid," he told me once, when I asked whether there existed some fuller history of the estate's finances beyond the current ledgers, a common failing of men who trust their own memory more than they ought. "I shouldn't worry yourself hunting for records that likely never existed in any organized form to begin with." I believed him entirely. I would not learn until much later how deliberately that reassurance had been chosen. I found the diary by accident, the way one finds most of the things that go on to matter more than anything found on purpose. I had been sorting through my father's study, a task I kept delaying and then forcing myself to complete in short, bearable increments, when I discovered, behind a false panel at the back of his writing desk, a small collection of items that had clearly been kept deliberately hidden rather than simply misplaced. A packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, a miniature portrait of a young woman I did not recognize, and a diary bound in cracked green leather, its spine so worn the title stamped there had long since become illegible. The handwriting inside was not my father's. It was, I would soon determine from the dates and the signature on the final page, my grandmother's, Lady Beatrice Ashvale, who had died when my father was still a young man, and whom I knew only through a formal portrait in the east hallway, and a small handful of stories repeated so often They had worn smooth as river stones, losing whatever specific truth they once contained. I began reading it the same night, by candlelight, telling myself I would stop after a few pages. I did not stop until dawn. The early pages held nothing more alarming than the ordinary texture of a young woman's life a century before my own. Complaints about a dressmaker's poor stitching, a fondness for a particular hound long since dead, a running, affectionate commentary on a sister 2 years her senior, who apparently possessed a temper my grandmother found both exasperating and secretly admirable. I read those early entries almost fondly, charmed by the small human ordinariness of a woman I had only ever known as a stern painted face in the east hallway, and it was precisely that fondness, I think, that made the entries which followed so much harder to absorb when they finally arrived, as though the diary had spent 40 pages earning my trust before it required me to use that trust against everything I thought I knew about my own family. I remember setting the diary down once, somewhere past midnight, and walking the length of the study simply to steady my own hands before I could make myself continue. The candle had burned low enough that the portrait of my grandmother, visible through the study door in the hallway beyond, seemed to watch the whole proceeding with an expression I had never before found unsettling, and now could not stop seeing as something closer to guilt. My grandmother's diary began ordinarily enough: accounts of dinners, observations about neighbors, the small domestic weather of a woman's daily life in a house not yet entirely her own. But some 40 pages in, the entries changed in a way that made my hands go cold even before I understood exactly what I was reading. "I have done a terrible thing," she had written, in a hand noticeably less steady than the entries surrounding it. "And I do not know if there will ever be a day when I am brave enough to undo it. Prudence deserved better than what our family gave her. She deserved the truth, at the very least, even if she could never have the inheritance our father took from her the moment she chose love over his approval. I told myself when I said nothing that I was protecting the family name. I understand now that I was only protecting my own share of it." I read that entry perhaps a dozen times before I fully absorbed what it implied. My grandmother had a sister I had never once heard mentioned, in 26 years of family stories, in any of the portraits or letters or half-remembered anecdotes that made up my understanding of where I came from. The entries that followed, scattered across several months of my grandmother's diary, and clearly written only when guilt outweighed her caution, told a story my family had spent decades ensuring no one would ever piece together. Prudence Ashvale, my grandmother's elder sister, and by rights, the true heir to Ashvale Manor under the inheritance customs observed by our family at the time, had fallen in love as a young woman with the estate carpenter named Thomas Vane, a man of considerable skill, but no fortune or family name worth mentioning in the circles my great-grandfather cared about. When Prudence refused to end the connection, our great-grandfather disowned her entirely, struck her from the family will, and forbade any member of the household from speaking her name again, a prohibition my grandmother had apparently honored in public for the whole of her life, while privately recording, in the one place she believed no one would ever read it, the shame that honoring it had cost her. Father left everything to me instead. My grandmother had written, in the diary's final relevant entry, dated some 40 years before my birth. Not because I was the elder, I was not, but because I was the daughter who stayed obedient. I have spent 30 years telling myself Prudence chose her own exile. I no longer believe that excuses what the rest of us did with the inheritance she was never permitted to refuse. If I am ever brave enough, I will find her line and make some restitution before I die. I have not yet been brave enough. I fear now that I never will be. She never was. The diary ended there, unfinished, the way my father's sentence had ended unfinished in the solicitor's office decades later, as though some particular Ashvale cowardice had simply passed itself down the generations, like an inheritance no one had the courage to formally accept or refuse. I did not know, in the days after reading it, what precisely I intended to do with what I had learned. Ashvale Manor was legally, unambiguously mine. No court in the country would have questioned the inheritance, built as it was on paperwork nearly a century old, and entirely undisturbed by the private guilt my grandmother had confessed only to herself. I could have burned the diary. I could have told myself, as 3 generations before me apparently had, that the sin belonged to the dead and the inheritance belonged to the living, and left it at that. I found that I could not. I told myself it was justice I wanted, though I have since come to suspect it was something closer to relief. The relief of finally being permitted to want something my family's careful silence had never allowed any of us to want honestly. I began, quietly and without telling Silas or Mr. Fenwick what I was searching for, to trace what had become of Prudence Ashvale's line. The search took the better part of 6 weeks, conducted in stolen afternoons between estate business, through parish records and old correspondence, and the careful, patient questioning of elderly tenants who remembered, or half-remembered, a scandal from before their own memory properly began. The parish records office in the nearest market town proved less helpful than I had hoped. A fire some decades earlier had claimed a full shelf of registers, and the clerk who assisted me, an elderly man with a magnificent memory for gossip if not for precise dates, could offer little beyond a vague recollection that some Ashvale girl or other had married beneath her station and been quietly written out of polite conversation. It was only through a chance mention of a Vane family living near the eastern boundary of the county that I found my first real thread to follow, and I spent an entire fortnight afterward writing careful, deliberately vague letters of inquiry to 3 separate parishes before one finally yielded a marriage record bearing both names I needed. An elderly tenant named Mrs. Hollis, who had lived on Ashvale land her whole life and remembered my great-grandfather with a fear she did not bother to disguise, was the one who finally gave the story its human shape rather than its paper one. There was talk when I was a girl, she told me. Over tea she insisted on making herself, despite my protests. A daughter sent away sudden-like, no explanation given, and the family never spoke her name again in company. My own mother said it was a scandal too old and too dangerous to repeat. Even by then, I never thought I'd live to see an Ashvale come asking after her on purpose. Prudence, I learned, had married her carpenter and lived a modest, apparently contented life in a village some 15 miles from Ashvale, dying only a decade past, having raised 2 children who had, in turn, raised children of their own. One of those grandchildren I discovered through a chain of records that took me 3 separate trips to confirm was currently employed as a carpenter himself, in a workshop not 4 miles from Ashvale's own boundary. Close enough, I realized with a discomfort I did not immediately examine, that I might easily have crossed paths with him a dozen times without either of us knowing what history sat unspoken between us. His name was Nathaniel Vane. I resolved, The night I confirmed it, to see him for myself before I decided what, if anything, to do about what my grandmother's cowardice and my own strange inheritance of it now required of me. I spent longer than I would like to admit simply standing at the edge of the village where he lived, before I found the courage to approach the workshop directly, watching from a discreet distance as ordinary village life carried on, entirely unaware that a woman was standing there recalculating, in real time, the whole shape of her own family's history against the sight of a stranger's workshop sign swinging gently in the afternoon wind. I had expected, I think, to feel triumphant upon finally locating him, some sense of a puzzle satisfyingly completed. What I felt instead was closer to vertigo, the particular dizziness of understanding that a decision I could no longer avoid making was about to become entirely, irreversibly real the moment I walked through that door. I very nearly turned back twice. I am glad, now, that I did not. I told myself I visited the workshop on ordinary estate business, a broken gate needing repair, a plausible enough errand for the mistress of Ashvale to bring personally, rather than send a servant to arrange. I did not entirely believe my own excuse, and judging by the faint, curious look Nathaniel Vane gave me when I arrived, I suspect he did not fully believe it either, though he was too well-mannered to say so. He was not what I had allowed myself to imagine in the 6 weeks I had spent thinking of him only as a fact to be confirmed rather than a person to be met. He spoke of his craft with the quiet precision of a man who took genuine pride in work done well rather than work done quickly, and when I asked, testing some private theory I had not fully admitted to myself, whether his family had always been carpenters, he answered without any evident bitterness at all. "My grandfather was the first," he said. "Before that, I understand there was some connection to a grander family somewhere up the valley, though nobody ever told me much about it. My grandmother didn't like to speak of where she came from. I always assumed there'd been some falling out not worth digging into." I said nothing to correct him. I told myself I needed more time to decide how to proceed before I upended a stranger's understanding of his own history. I have since come to suspect I was simply afraid, in that first meeting, of how quickly I had begun to care whether the news, when I finally delivered it, would change the easy warmth with which he'd spoken to me. I returned to the workshop more often than any gate genuinely required repairing, and I told myself, each time, that I was still only gathering the courage to tell him the truth, rather than simply enjoying, dishonestly, the ordinary pleasure of his company before the truth arrived to complicate it. He was, I learned across those weeks, unhurried in a way I had rarely encountered among the men of my own circle, patient with difficult wood the same way he was patient with difficult questions, willing to sit in a silence rather than fill it with something false just to seem clever. He asked me once, mending a chair I did not particularly need mended, why the mistress of a manor house spent so many afternoons in a carpenter's workshop instead of at whatever finer entertainments her station afforded her. "I find I prefer honest work to false conversation," I told him, which was true, though it was not yet the whole truth I owed him. "That's a fine way to put off answering the actual question," he said, not unkindly, and I understood that he was considerably less easily managed than I had first assumed, and that whatever I finally told him would need to be the complete truth, offered plainly, or he would see straight through anything less. There was an afternoon, some weeks into those visits, when a sudden storm trapped me at the workshop far longer than any gate repair could plausibly justify. Nathaniel built up the small stove in the corner without comment, made a pot of coarse, strong tea in a chipped workman's cup he apologized for before handing to me, and settled into the silence of waiting out weather with the same unhurried patience he brought to a difficult joint in a piece of furniture. I found myself, somewhere in that hour, telling him about my father's unfinished sentence, a piece of grief I had not yet spoken aloud to anyone, not even Fenwick. "It sounds like the sentence isn't really the thing you're mourning," he said, after a while. "It's everything he might have said, if he'd had the years to get around to it." I did not tell him, that afternoon, how closely his observation echoed the diary I had not yet found the courage to mention. I only sat with him until the rain passed, and rode home slower than the clearing sky required. There was another evening, later still, when I brought him a book I thought he might enjoy, a foolish excuse, since I could as easily have sent it by a servant, and found him repairing a child's rocking horse for a tenant family too poor to commission anything grander. He worked on it with the same care he gave every piece that passed through his hands, and when I asked why he bothered, for so little payment, on something so small, he seemed almost surprised by the question. "A child doesn't know the difference between a fortune and a well-made toy," he said. "I'd rather be the kind of man who makes the toy properly than the kind who only takes the jobs worth boasting about." I remember thinking, riding home that night, that I had spent weeks searching parish records for a stranger's bloodline when the truest evidence of his grandmother's character was sitting in front of me the whole time, in the quality of the work he chose to be proud of. It was Silas who forced my hand, in the end, though not through any suspicion of Nathaniel. He had no notion the man existed at all. Going through the estate's older financial records to settle a dispute over a tenant's boundary, I discovered a pattern of small, quiet payments made decades earlier, from the Ashvale estate to a firm of solicitors in a neighboring county, payments that ceased abruptly some 15 years before my birth, around the time, I would later confirm, of Prudence Vane's death. When I asked Silas, carefully, whether he knew anything of old payments to a firm by that name, his composure slipped for just a moment, the same brief hesitation I had once seen in Mr. Fenwick, quickly smoothed over into practiced blankness. "Some old family matter, before either of our times," he said. "Best left where your father and grandfather left it, I should think. Digging up old scandals rarely does a family any good, Cordelia. Surely you understand that." I understood, in that moment, that Silas knew considerably more than he was willing to say, and that his sudden, generous willingness to help me settle my father's accounts had perhaps never been entirely about grief or family duty at all. A man who benefits from a silence has every reason to help maintain it, and Silas, unmarried and next in line to Ashvale should I die without an heir of my own, had more reason than most to prefer the family's old arrangements stay exactly as undisturbed as 3 generations had left them. I confronted Mr. Fenwick directly the following week, laying my grandmother's diary on his desk, without preamble, and watching whatever remained of his careful composure finally give way entirely. "Your father knew," he admitted, quietly, after a long silence. "He discovered it himself, some years before his death, going through his own mother's papers much as you have gone through his. He made those payments to the Vane family for a number of years afterward, a kind of quiet restitution, though He was never brave enough to make it an open one. He stopped when his own father, your great-grandfather, the one who first disowned Prudence, threatened to contest his management of the estate entirely if the payments continued. Your father chose the safer path. I did not think it my place to judge him for it, and I confess I did not think it my place to volunteer the information to you unprompted, given how carefully your family has always preferred these matters handled. And Silas? I asked. Does he know the particulars? I could not say with certainty, Fenwick admitted, but I would imagine a man so attentive to the estate's older ledgers has drawn his own conclusions, whatever he has chosen to do with them. I confronted Silas directly that same evening, in the library, with my grandmother's diary open on the table between us and every carefully gathered record of the old payments laid out beside it. I know what our family did to Prudence Vane, I told him. I know my father made restitution and stopped when it became inconvenient. I intend to finish what he started. Silas's composure, so carefully maintained across every previous conversation, finally cracked into something closer to the truth beneath it. And what precisely do you imagine that accomplishes? He said, You'll hand some carpenter a fortune he has no notion he's owed, unravel 100 years of settled inheritance, and for what? To ease your own conscience over a sin you didn't commit. I have spent 10 years managing a smaller estate competently, while you inherited the larger one simply by being born to the right father. Do not lecture me about what this family owes to fairness, Cordelia. I have made my peace with what fairness actually looks like in families like ours. I would advise you to make the same peace, before you throw away everything our grandfather worked to secure. Our grandfather secured it by disowning his own daughter, I said. I am not interested in making peace with that. I went to Nathaniel the following morning and told him everything. The diary, my grandmother's confession, the payments my father had made and abandoned, the true history of the grandmother he had been told so little about. I had rehearsed the conversation a dozen ways in the sleepless hours before dawn, and none of my rehearsals had prepared me for how quietly he received it, setting down his tools and listening without interruption until I had finished. I don't know what you want me to say, he said finally. You're telling me my grandmother was cheated out of a fortune, and that you're the one standing to lose most of it if you make that right. Most people in your position would have burned that diary the night they found it. I nearly did, I admitted. I told myself for weeks that I was only gathering facts before I decided. I think I had already decided the night I read it. I only needed the courage my grandmother and my father never quite managed to find. And if I refuse it? He asked. I've built a life I'm proud of with my own 2 hands. I'm not certain I want a fortune I never earned, built on a sister's exile I only just learned happened at all. Then we'll find some arrangement that lets you keep the life you built while still setting right what my family took. I said, I am not asking you to become someone else, Nathaniel. I am only asking to stop being the kind of family that pretends this never happened. He was quiet for a long while after that, turning a half-finished table leg over in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking through a difficult cut before committing to it. My grandmother used to say her family died before she ever left home, he said finally. I always assumed she meant it as a figure of speech. I wonder now if she meant it rather more literally than that as far as your family was concerned, she simply ceased to exist the day she chose my grandfather over her own name. He set the table leg down carefully. I'll want to see the diary myself. if you don't mind. I think I owe her that much. To read it in her own sister's hand, rather than take even a story this important second-hand. I brought it to him the following day, and sat with him in the quiet of his workshop while he read the same pages that had kept me awake the whole first night, watching his face carefully for whatever it might show me. He read slowly, the way a careful man reads something he suspects will matter for the rest of his life, and when he finally closed the cover, his eyes were wet in a way he did not try to hide from me. "She sounds like she was sorry," he said. "Your grandmother, I mean. Sorry, and too much of a coward to do anything useful with the sorry, while it might still have mattered to my grandmother directly." He looked up at me. "You're not a coward, Cordelia. Whatever else this costs you, I'll say that for you plainly." What followed took the better part of a year to settle properly. Solicitors from both families, a careful accounting of the estate's actual value, and a great many long evenings in which Nathaniel and I worked out, slowly and honestly, what restitution could look like between two people who had, somewhere in the process of settling an old family's debt, begun building the beginning of something neither of us had originally intended. The negotiations themselves were rarely comfortable. Nathaniel's own solicitor, a sharp, careful woman named Miss Adeline Cross who took the case, she told me plainly, precisely because she relished the rare opportunity to argue a poor family's claim against a rich one, pressed every figure Fenwick proposed, with a thoroughness that occasionally left our meetings feeling more like negotiations between hostile nations than the settling of a family matter. I did not resent her for it. I had spent my whole life on the comfortable side of arrangements exactly like this one, and it seemed to me only right that someone finally argued as fiercely for the other side as 3 generations of Ashvale solicitors had once argued against it. There were setbacks. Silas, before his departure, attempted quietly to contest the settlement's legality on the grounds that no formal legal claim had ever been filed within the customary period following Prudence's disinheritance, a technical objection that very nearly succeeded and was defeated only when Fenwick produced my father's old abandoned payment records as evidence that the family itself had long ago implicitly acknowledged the debt's legitimacy. I remember the particular satisfaction of watching Silas's final objection collapse under the weight of my own father's guilty conscience, preserved in ledger entries he had never expected anyone to examine so closely. We did not divide Ashvale Manor in the end, nor did Nathaniel abandon his workshop for a life of leisure he had never wanted. Instead, working with Fenwick and a solicitor of Nathaniel's own choosing, we established a settlement that secured his family's long-overdue portion of the Ashvale fortune while leaving the manor itself and the responsibility of its tenants and its land in careful joint stewardship, a solution neither of our grandmothers could have imagined, born as they were into a world with far fewer honest choices than the one Nathaniel and I found ourselves fortunate enough to inherit instead. Silas left Ashvale within the month, taking a considerably reduced role in the estate's affairs, and, I am told, a rather larger grudge with him, though I have made my peace with the fact that not every relative reconciles themselves to justice simply because it has finally arrived. Mrs. Hollis, the tenant who had first given Prudence's story its human shape, lived long enough to see the settlement finalized, and told me, the last time I visited her, that she had never expected to see an old wrong actually righted in her lifetime, rather than merely gossiped about. Most families just let the shame go quiet and call that healing, she said. You did something harder than quiet. I have thought of that distinction often since. The difference between a silence that heals and a silence that only waits, patiently, to be inherited by someone braver than the person who first chose it. Fenwick stayed on as solicitor to both halves of the arrangement, remarking once, dryly, that he had spent 20 years managing my father's careful avoidances and found it a considerable relief, in his final working years, to manage something built on the opposite principle instead. It has been 3 years now since I found my grandmother's diary behind that false panel, and I keep it still, not hidden this time, but displayed openly on the same desk where my father once sat writing letters he never finished. Alongside the diary I have kept myself since that first sleepless night. Proof, I like to think, that some family habits are worth breaking and others, like the simple act of writing down an inconvenient truth, are worth keeping, provided one is finally brave enough to act on what the writing reveals. Nathaniel asks, sometimes, whether I regret how much upheaval one old diary caused in a life that might otherwise have continued comfortably undisturbed. I tell him honestly that I do not, that I would rather inherit a complicated truth openly than a comfortable lie by default, and that the manor feels, for the first time in 3 generations, entirely and honestly ours. If this story found something true in you tonight, I hope you will let it stay with you a little longer. Subscribe to the sealed diary so the next entry finds you when it is finally written, and tell me below what you think you would have done, in my place, the night you first read what your own family had spent generations trying not to remember. Ring the little bell beside the subscribe button so you never miss the moment a new diary is unsealed. Thank you for staying with me through this one. There is always another entry waiting.